Okay, perfect. So, good afternoon, everyone. Morning or evening to wherever you are located. My name is Ruslan. I'm the Director of Business Development for Agile Sparks. We have here Melissa. She's going to introduce herself a little bit later. And Dwayne Stroman, the presenter, who I'm going to introduce in a few minutes. Said that, welcome to our Agile Sparks Lean Agile Budgeting, or in short, LAB webinar. Please feel to add any and all questions that you have under the Q&A section on Zoom. We'll try to get to most of, not all the questions towards the end of the webinar. If we see something that we need to answer right now, we will definitely do so. Now, this webinar is going to be recorded, and we're going to share it with you right after the webinar itself. Now, if you're not familiar with Agile Sparks, we'll run a short introduction in the next slide. Agile Sparks is an agile consulting and training company and offers global solution with presence in Europe, Israel, India, and of course, the United States. We are a Scaled Agile Gold SPCT partner and Scrum.org partner, which is not to say regarding if or not we can use Lean Agile Budgeting with either of those or without using any of those, which Dwayne is going to touch a little bit later about that as well. We have proven experience in transforming over 400 companies worldwide, from small companies to startups to Fortune 500 companies. And you can see some of our customers in this slide, actually. Thank you, Dwayne. If you want to learn about our customers, about our transformation and implementation, please visit our website, agilesparks.com, and you can find the list of our case studies under About and Clients Case Studies. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dwayne Stroman, our own SPCT. Dwayne spent 20 plus years as a software engineer, architect, and product developer, and spent the last 15, if not more years, learning, implementing, and coaching Agile and Lean principles and practices. He is ultra passionate about helping large organizations learn about how to build the right products and deliver optimal value through learning and customer validation. Dwayne has used Safe Program Consulting, his Safe Program Consultant trainer, sorry for that, role to help several Fortune 100 companies, as well as many growing companies in finance, retail, and logistics, and realizing the benefits of Lean Agile mindset. Said that, I think that I was talking too long, and Dwayne, take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Ruslan. So welcome, everyone. As Ruslan said, we're going to talk about Lean Agile Budgeting, or as we have kind of coined the term, LAB. Before I start, I want to acknowledge my partner in crime, John Miller, who was key in helping, and a fellow SPCT, who was key in helping me learn about accounting in the real world, budgeting in the real world. To be honest, John has forgotten more about budgeting and finance in large corporations than I will ever know. So I want to acknowledge all of his great assistance. So let's talk about traditional budgeting practices. We're going to talk briefly about some of the practices that are out there. Were they a means to an end? Absolutely. The problem is, if we're looking at moving towards a Lean Agile product development lifecycle, what we're discovering is that traditional funding methods just do not support that. And that's the key focus of this conversation. So the first problem we see is the crystal ball. We have tried for many years to predict the future. And the reality is, when we lived in very complicated, but not complex environments, complicated being, same inputs in, same outputs out, traditional budgeting worked. It was still rather heavyweight, and there were a lot of extra things added on. The problem is, living in the complex world that we live today, where same inputs in can create very different outputs out. That's a big difference. And traditional budgeting just runs afoul of that. It's contradictory to what we're trying to do. In fact, as you see in this quote here, modern formal budgets, they try to predict income. They try to predict a year ahead of time. And they've really evolved these tools into tools of constraint and tools of control. Well, in many cases, we obviously need control and constraint, but it's also blocked us from being able to move into lean, agile product development approaches. And here's an example of where that really comes to light is the traditional yearly budgeting approach. Now, your patterns might be slightly different to very different, but the end result is the same. That we start out in, let's say, June, July, and August of when calendar and fiscal year align, we start out in those summer months and we start to predict the budget for the following year. We create that budget, we go through a number of efforts and work and so on, and we come up with this budget. There's probably a lot of gnashing of teeth and pulling of hair, but we finally come to that. And then we get into the first month, spend versus value, whether you're measuring by NPV, earned value, whatever it might be, and something's wrong. We missed. Well, it's only because, not through lack of effort, but it's because we were trying to predict the future. And the problem we have is that we as humans are not very good at predicting the future. When we talk about stock analyst predictions and so forth, we're going to cover that later, but how inaccurate they really can be, even though they're highly informed, highly trained people, we're just not good at predicting the future. So as we go into the budget cycle, at the end of January, we go through a review process and maybe there's some slapping of hands and so forth because you missed the budget projections. Okay, we go into the next budget. We needed a little bit more money in this case. Okay, so go through the change management and all that. Here's your extra money. And we then can adjust scope. But then as we start to realize, wait a minute, we need to tone that down. So now we adjust scope again. We get into the late spring months, and now project starts to get canceled. We start to remove people from the effort. That's where we start to get into that concern approach, where we have the euphoria of starting the new budget. There's the new contract, there's the spend and all of that happens. And as we start to go through the late spring and early summer months, we start to have that concern. Wait, my bonus is tied to meeting this budget. My incentives are around that. My promotion is tied around this. If we don't get it right, bad things will happen. So we need to adjust down. So we start to lay off contractors. We start to adjust projects, perhaps even cancel them, and they might still be valuable. And then we get to that end of the year cycle where, oops, we misjudged again, and we have money left. And you know the pattern, either use it or lose it. So we have that approach of saying, okay, we're going to use it for maybe things that aren't really directly tied to delivering on this value, or we lose it the next year, neither which are very good outcomes. So that's one of the key problems. And here's where a lot of this comes from, this hierarchical aspect of traditional budgeting. And again, this comes from the approach we've taken from a complicated world, not a complex world. And in a complicated world, this can work, maybe not the best, but it can work, where we start out with this large pile of money for the entire enterprise, the entire organization. Here is our budget for operating costs, for new features and so forth, moving forward, new capabilities. And then we do a good thing. We fund to our goals. We say, okay, based on what we're trying to accomplish this year, we're willing to attribute this much money to this goal and this much to this. Now, the process of getting there may be a little bit more murky and clouded because it's back and forth trading and so forth, not as much based on real data as we would like it to be. But this is still a fairly good, healthy practice because we're essentially putting our money where our mouths are. Here's the problem. Is then once we get those budgets, we break that down into smaller budgets and so on and so forth, until we get to the point where we really have a difficulty seeing why this small isolated project is even funded in the first place. Not to mention all the cost goes into it. Because here's the reality. Over our years of research and working with companies, we've discovered, and there are other authors, experts that have given about the same number, the average enterprise spends about 30% of its yearly budget on managing its budget. Now, when we brought this number to CFO types, the financial groups and so forth, at first we expected to get a pushback and say, no, it's not that much. The reality is they say the opposite. It's probably a little more than that, or perhaps even substantially more than that. When you think about all the costs involved in change management and budget review, budget creation, and so forth. In fact, Brian Maskell, in his several of his books, he talks about when a finance group, just the finance group alone, goes lean, they can save up to about 70% of their management budget for that finance group. And what happens is these people that are highly educated, highly trained towards working towards creating better outcomes, finding new markets, finding what the financial opportunities are, instead are moving dollars from this column to this column, sitting in approval meetings and so forth. And so not only do we spend a lot of money, we waste a lot of time, valuable thinking power tied to that. If you think about it, how many hours you spend, creating the budget, approving it, correcting it, change management, all of those detailed things that we have to go through. So enough about what's bothering us. Let's talk about how to move forward. Let's talk about some of the principles behind it. And one of the things I want to talk about is to move forward to lean, agile budgeting approach is it really does require some underlying principles. Now, we're not going to cover every principle. There's a number of principles that really go into this. I'm going to talk about some of the higher level ones that I think will have the most impact. I have seen have the most impact. And the first one is don't fund projects, fund the factory. And what this really means is, as an organization, we typically will fund a project here, a project there, and so forth. What we want to do is say, you know what, let's just fund the machine and let's stand up this machine so that it can deliver as much value as possible. So that first principle, tying back to how we break that budget down and down and down, here's the alternate approach we want. We want to fund value streams instead. So going to those fund to your goals approach, excellent. Let's understand what those underlying value streams are. And I won't get into details on what value streams are in this conversation. However, just to keep us all on the same page, a value stream is simply a set of interconnected steps that you would go through to deliver value. It includes the people, the systems, the solutions, in operational approach, it includes the customers and so forth. But it's that set of steps we use to go through to deliver value. And when we focus on those organizational constructs outside of the org chart, but much more from a value stream network approach, and we fund those efforts, we now essentially have a factory. And this factory is set up to deliver as much value as possible, which frees us from a lot of that detailed, aggregated, tightly coupled to specific widgets going out the factory. Instead, we're funding the factory to deliver as much value as possible. James Womack talked about this, and he said, the number of people that are not charging the value stream need to be minimized. And he even said, yes, the janitor, everyone associated to delivering that value should be associated to that value stream budget. That's where a lot of the savings comes in, is we're not trying to determine this bucket, this bucket, this bucket, and so on. It's a much larger bucket. Now, to do that, let's talk about another approach. We have to understand another key way to sequence effort within that factory, and that's cost of delay. Now, Don Reinertsen did a lot of work on this in his book, Principles of Product Development Flow. But I love this quote. It's really the golden key that unlocks many doors, the astonishing power it has. I have seen cost of delay, and it's associated what we call weighted shortest job first, or WSJF, if you will, used as a tool to completely clear out what it is we're trying to focus on, what we're trying to deliver. For example, I worked with a large bank, and in this bank, their division of about 5,000 people, they were focused on that yearly budget approach, traditional approach, and they were starting to implement SAFE. But again, these concepts and principles still apply even if you're not implementing SAFE. They're probably more valuable and useful in a SAFE context, but it's not required. What they were able to do is take this cost of delay approach, and they use this principle, sequencing for optimum economics, and they use that in parallel next to their yearly budgeting process. So they still went through the traditional budgeting process, but alongside it, they did weighted shortest job first, cost of delay divided by job size, and use that to rank economic sequencing. Now, 5,000 people, fairly large division, they're just learning. That wasn't ready. They weren't quite ready to move forward and say, that's how we're going to budget. But it so altered their thinking and so heavily informed how they set up their budget in their normal approach that they decided the next year to actually move forward with it as the main information gathering tool for how they construct their budget. And we're going to talk about that later, but that's a very healthy approach, is to take this one step at a time. Okay, let's talk about another problem: decentralized or centralized decision makings. What we have very often is a very centralized approach, a issue where all of decisions have to filter up to the very top. And again, that ties into that budgeting construct. If we need to make a small change here, it has to filter up multiple steps, multiple ways. And another thing that Don Reinertson pointed out, and from his work, is yes, companies spend a lot of time focused on those 3 or 4 key decisions they make every year. But in reality, it's those hundreds of decisions that are made every day. Those tend to have as much or more impact than those 3 or 4 key strategic decisions. And so how do we set it up so that we can create a system that's tied to those localized, decentralized decisions? And this is it. Now I'm incorporating one of the scaled agile principles, SAFE principle number 9, decentralizing decision-making. This does not mean throwing all controls away, all constraints away. Many of those are required and needed. What it does mean is that we can rethink how we apply those. When we go back to the previous principle, funding value streams, now within those value streams, we can allow that local authority and bring that information to those local authorities, to those value stream managers, and give them the information so they can make the decisions in a localized format. And even as we work within the value stream, because we've funded the factory, now we can decentralize decisions within that factory of what's the most important thing to work on, using tools such as weighted shortest job first for economic sequencing. Okay, let's talk about another concept that we often struggle with, and that's dealing with indicators. How do we know if we're going the right direction? And this is a common issue that companies face, is they have traditional measurement approaches that tend to be very lagging. And the problem is we try to retrofit those. We're moving to lean agile product development, which has become the de facto go-to in this modern day of how to solve problems of keeping up with our competition and moving forward. But we try to take these traditional minded indicators and move them forward into a lean agile world, and they just don't fit. And so trying to convert those, we often struggle a lot because they're just lagging indicators, so we don't have the information to feed the processes that we need to feed. And so here's the principle: use lean startup and innovation accounting instead. Focus on the learning approach. Again, as humans, we're not very good at predicting the future. We're very poor at it. So instead, let's take advantage of all the things we need to properly understand the direction we need to go. Some of the key examples of this is creating simple web portals, creating documents and so forth early on that require very little investment. I'm going to show you an example in a bit, but require very little investment to learn quickly. And then you see how the innovation accounting or the lean startup process works, is we start with an idea and then we build something, but we don't build the entire effort. We don't build the entire suite, the entire $5 million effort, let's say. We build just enough to learn. And that gives us a product. Now it is an MVP, a minimum viable product, but it's enough for us to learn and to get started with. And then we measure. We measure the impact of what we've delivered. We take a look at that and say, let's learn quickly. First of all, is this even the right thing to do? Is this the right approach? And if so, how should we move forward? Should we continue on? Is this the right direction? In many cases, the data comes back and says, no, that was a good idea. It's the wrong approach. It may even call into question our strategy, but most often the strategy is healthy in a good direction. It's the implementation of that strategy that we need to adjust. And so these early learning efforts help us very quickly isolate and move down to what's really going to help us move forward. Now, we do that through data. We bring in key data points, and this is where the leading indicators are so critical. Again, these are things that we can see in as little as months and sometimes even weeks, not years. It's not building a product, putting it out there and waiting for a year to see if we're going to get the ROI we expected. Instead, it can be as short as in 2 weeks to put something simple out, learn from that, and determine, is this the right approach? Is this how we should move forward? So let's take a look at an example. Now, I found this while I was preparing for this, and I recently rented a car from Hertz. And if you follow down through the receipt at the bottom of the email, there's a very, very simple addition to the email. You're seeing it. It's a very simple component of, hey, did you know we sell our vehicles? Click here to learn more. How many of us have clicked on those types of things where either it's about a white paper on additional information or to attend this session, perhaps to attend this webinar, something that you want to gain more information on? Even if we click that link and do nothing further, that has helped the company to learn, because now they know, one, people are seeing that advertisement. So at the bottom of the email, it's working. If we sent out 100 emails and we expect a 5% conversion, and we get 6 people clicking on that, moving to the page out of that 100, we met our indicators. Good. We are using the right medium, if you will. Now, if they clicked on that link, this is what you see. It's a very simple, basic web page that we could put up fairly quickly to see, are we going to go the right direction? And as people see this, now we can determine, based on how many people actually start to enter information, how long they stay on the page, and all of those things. We don't even have to have an ability to sell cars yet. We might simply be gathering information. When we get the information, send them back a brochure about the plans for selling cars in the future. Very simple addition, very simple way to move forward and determine, and very quickly, is this a viable business opportunity? If so, let's pursue it. If not, let's try something else. And Ruslan, I want to pause here and see if there are any questions so far.
There are a couple, but let's start with a question by Dervin Roland. And he's asking, how do I take the first step toward lab when I have never implemented it and my finance department may not have a clue what it is?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually a really good segue into the next step. Are you ready? Getting started. And this, I want to spend a fair amount of time on discussing this, because this is really, I hope, the incentive for attending this webinar is, how do I get started in this? So far, I may not have given anyone huge aha moments. It's where you start to actually implement this that you really learn. And to get started, first of all, you do need to have a strategy. And I like the think big, act small approach. Think big to the end goal. What's our why? Do we know why we want to do this? And just having that statement I made at the beginning about traditional budgeting doesn't support lean, agile product development, that's a starting point. It's not a true why. We really need to understand what that why is. And then we need to have a long-term vision. Where do we want to go with this? Where do we see us with a funding perspective, a funding model 2 years down the road, 3 years, 5 years down the road? In that case, creating that vision, it needs to be specific, achievable, but challenging. We need to make it fairly difficult. Difficult enough that it's going to make us move forward, it's going to make us work, but it's still something that's directly achievable. And from that, then creating a roadmap. What's the first step we're going to take on? And we're going to talk about some of those steps next, of some of the things you can choose from. But I will tell you, that's a very individualistic, it depends on the domain, private sector, public sector, what marketplace you're in, where your current budgeting process is. Some are quite constrained and very slowing them down. Some are maybe a little bit closer to what we've been talking about so far. So understanding where you're at, creating that vision of where we want to go forward, creating that roadmap of how to get started. And then when you act small, and this is critical, incremental iterative steps. I'm going to show you an example in a bit about how critical that is, how important it is. But as you move forward, you're not going to be able to take huge leaps and bounds. Your roadmap and your strategy needs to have incremental steps. For example, one story I will tell. one client I worked with, first started working with them, engaging with them, and we started talking about the inefficiencies of traditional budgeting as applied to Lean Agile product development. They were very excited about Lean Agile product development, had no idea that the budgeting and funding approach would have to change to go with it. So as we talked about it, they got very excited about doing this. Well, it happened to be Christmas break. And so we took off for a couple of weeks, and I came back in early January, and they had completely eliminated all of the tooling for project managers to track projects at the project level from a funding perspective. So rather than having an iterative approach forward and an experimental approach, what they had was tried to cut this in half. And now they were struggling with, how do we deal with this? Because what happened was project managers simply said, oh, you pulled away the tooling, I will just do it in a local spreadsheet. So we have to really get those iterative approaches built into place. And that requires learning as you go. And that's where you start to talk about culture, because mindset and culture is a critical aspect of that. We all have mental models, and we all have these approaches that we take to thinking about how funding works from a traditional standpoint, how it could work from a different approach. We have to recognize how those are and how that cultural impact is. And then we start to change the system, meaning you don't tell people to think differently about budget. Instead, you change practices. You go and find specific practices you can change that will lead towards, again, part of your strategy, lead towards a lean, agile budgeting approach. And it might be one incremental step on a roadmap of 100, 200, 300, but it starts to get that growth going. And then critical to that is measuring. You need to start measuring at the very beginning. And I often start with measuring how we're doing right now. How closely do we see our typical ways of measuring value associated to real outcomes? Do they really tell us how well we're doing from an outcome perspective? In most cases, no, they are kind of two ships passing in the night. And so then we try to find, how can we better measure true ROI, true actual benefit, as we fund this effort, fund that effort. And we use those measurements to adjust our roadmap and our strategy going forward. And that's how we can better show the value. And like I said, then adjust that path and roadmap going forward. Okay, Ruslan, I see we have one more question about how do you start the conversation, who to involve. Great question. You need to start where you can. And what I mean is, that may sound simplistic, but you may not have access to the C-suite. You may not have access to the CFO. You may only have access in your local scope. You still can get started. There's a number of things that you can put in place in your own sphere of the world, your own area of influence, that can start to influence. For example, economic sequencing, even if it's at a team of teams approach, if it's a collection of teams, a group of teams working together, if you can start to incorporate some type of economic sequencing, we suggest using a Kanban approach, using what we would call a program Kanban, and using that weighted shortest job first, that economic sequencing approach within that. And now you create a clearly defined list of priorities where we see what is really the value and what is not. And from that perspective, that helps us to see what the next steps are and how to move forward. Okay, let's keep moving forward, and then we'll come back for some more questions again. Now, I started talking about mindset and culture, and this can be, usually is, the most difficult aspect. When we talk about changing our budgeting practices, our funding model, our finance model, it tends to make a lot of people very, very nervous. And we're going to talk more about how to deal with that, but that is the reality. And the truth is, when we talk about funding projects and we talk about moving away from that, right now in most of our organizations, if it's funded, we go forward. If it's not, we don't. That's the ultimate decision point. And usually those are unfortunately not well informed from the actual value outcome. The funding model itself can be aligned to, do I trust Ruslan with this budget? Okay, then I'm going to give it to him, whether I understand the true value behind it or not. Don Reinertson talked about some of those problems when he listed early on in his book about the problems with our current orthodoxy. Things like not correctly quantifying economics and quantifying economics down to the team level so that people really understand the economic impact of this decision versus this decision. If we're talking about software product development, hardware product development, if I select this component versus this one, or if I use this API versus this one, or if I build this widget to look like this versus this, what's the economic impact of that? And without having that viewpoint, it's really difficult to understand how to move forward. And as product developers, essentially working in the dark or following requirements that, again, were based on that predictive nature. One of the concerns that we have, as I've mentioned a few times, is this. We tend to have this ball of yarn approach. And what I mean is, in traditional funding, budgeting is very tangled and tied up in everything we do. In fact, Rami Sirkia, and I'm going to butcher his name, but Marie Lanti, talked about this, and they said, here's the problem. Agile software development, traditional cost accounting don't match. So we find that dichotomy, that contradiction almost between our current funding models and our approach to moving to Lean Agile budgeting. Most of the clients I work with are very excited about using some of the product development approaches from Lean and Agile. But when it comes to funding and budgeting, it tends to be a, no, we can't touch that. We can't go there. The bottom line is eventually we do need to get there. We do need to impact and work with it. Now, here's the thing that you do not want to do is to try and cut it in half, is to just slice and dice it and try to move forward without that piece of that understanding. What tends to happen here is similar to that example I gave of the project management tooling being taken away, is we don't know the outcome. We can't learn from it. And budgeting is a complex concept. It is a very complex thing. It's very intertwined in everything we do. So the only approach to really working with this, excuse me, correctly, is to untangle that ball of yarn a piece at a time. Take that iterative approach I talked about. So if we go back to that roadmap, it's really key to talking about having that clear roadmap of going forward. How are we going to iteratively and incrementally remove a lot of the constraints that we have? Because that's the truth behind Lean Agile budgeting. A lot of it is removing the current constraints. However, if you remember back to the decentralized decision making, if we don't give the authority and we don't give the clarity, we run into a lot of issues with that. Now, one last piece of guidance I want to give before we get to some more questions is be careful who you get to assist with this. Now, we're going to talk about a number of ways to help move forward, how you can get started, but be careful of this. These guys mean well, and they want to help, but without knowing the ramifications of changing this versus changing that, what those potential system pitfalls might be, we can cause more issues and more harm than we do good. And so it's very much a cautionary tale. Be careful how you move forward. In fact, myself and John Miller, we wrote a 2-day Lean Agile budgeting workshop course that is intended as an internal workshop approach to getting to Lean Agile budgeting. And the last module in it is called Creating a Plan That Won't Get You Fired, because it's about moving forward very incrementally and carefully and cautiously, but that doesn't mean slow. It means understanding the impact we believe we're going to see, moving forward that, measuring as we go, and then getting ready with the next change and the next change and the next change. I do want to talk about before we, actually, Ruslan, let's take one more question before we move on.
Sure. So I see that Bruce is asking, how do you do lean budgeting at the government level? I think that's a good question that can take us a few webinars, but if you can just address it a little bit.
Yes, let me, again, Bruce, I do want to be careful not to give direct accounting guidance. I am not an accountant. I do not want to give generic guidance that may not work for your situation, but there is a typical approach to this. And is it different with government? Yes, it is, because let's be honest, there are many things within government work, especially when you talk about defense industry perhaps VA work, like those types of things, that literally does take an act of Congress to change. So some of these things are outside of our control, even within the what we would call the enterprise, if you will. However, it still can be done. And my partner in crime, John Miller, has done a lot of these things. And the first thing, it's still the same steps. It's understand where we are at now and where are the pain points? Where are the struggles that we're facing? What is really slowing us down, especially within government? But this applies to private sector as well. If we're going to make a change, we need to be ready to very, very quickly show the value of it. And we need to do it in a small, almost low risk bubble, if you will, in small approaches. For example, one client I had, now this is actually a public sector company, but the same approach would work for government, is rather than saying, okay, the entire company of 50,000 people, we're going to move to Lean Agile Budgeting. Again, don't cut that ball of yarn in half. What we decided to do was to take two projects, traditional project approach, but instead of having the typical waterfall approval mechanism, phase gate approach, instead we simply said to these two projects, here's the pile of money that you asked for. Here's what we would like you to solve. And we did back away from these specific requirements. And instead we focused on what is it we're trying to solve? What are the outcomes we're looking for that we're willing to pay this much money to gain? Both of these efforts took about 6 months. After 6 months, both efforts returned a fairly significant chunk of money. I believe the budgets were both around $10 million per effort. The one delivered back about $2 million and the other one returned about $1.5 million. Now, traditional thinking would say, in fact, there were a lot of people within the organization that said, not a lot, but some of the project sponsors were almost dismayed and said, wait, I gave you 10 million. I want 10 million in value. But then we asked them the strong question about, did you receive the value? Yeah, actually, it was more than I expected. It was a much better outcome than I expected. But the mindset was so locked in to the fact that I gave you 10 million, you should therefore spend 10 million. We had to deal with that mindset first. And government is no different. You want to, again, think big, think about the long-term approach, but act small. And that's really the difference I've seen in government is the act small. It may be smaller steps. It may be more localized, more isolated. You might have to do a bit more work on the side to actually make this work. One more example I can, and again, this is from a private sector, so be careful with these examples, but this particular organization wanted to move to funding value streams. In this case, they were implementing scaled agile, and so they had 2 agile release trains. And they wanted to fund these 2 agile release trains so that they really could do the fund the factory approach and move from opportunity to opportunity quickly, highest priority outcome, without going through all of the change management. Well, both of these agile release trains were funded with about 250 projects per train, roughly, for the year. Well, someone within the organization had a very brilliant idea, and she decided, why don't we take that money and funnel it into one project ID? That's how we're going to fund the agile release train, and then we'll work with the project cost accounting, the reporting mechanism, and so that on the back end to report back on how we're making progress. So they went ahead with that. After 6 months, they went back to the leadership group, the sponsors of these multiple projects, and said, we would like to move to this different funding model, this lean agile budgeting approach. What do you think? And they said, absolutely, it will not work. That's not a chance it will work. And that's when they disclosed, well, that's actually what we've been doing the last 6 months, and you've been thrilled with the outcomes. So again, especially from a government perspective, I'm not advocating in any way pulling the wool over anyone's eyes or anything like that, but start small, gain those small victories, build on that energy. A lot of those small victories can be as simple as simply economically sequencing opportunities, even if you do it within your internal organization and bring that back to your sponsors, whether they be internal government or their liaisons, whatever it may be, and you're showing them the outcome of it. They may not agree to go with that, but it's starting to inform the system, starting to inform the process. Okay, I think we have another question. Mention examples where mindset of culture have changed or have considered to change. Yes. A number of examples. As I mentioned with that one private sector company that funded those two projects, that's one key example. And it's really exemplary of what typically happens. People go into this with a very rarely, and never in my experience, have I had, especially the financial minded people, the people that are managing the project funding, the people that are allocating the budgets and so forth, say, this is going to be great. It's going to be incredible. There's no way it won't work. No, they go into it with a level of fear and trepidation. But they're understanding enough through education. We've educated them. We've shown them the opportunities. We've shown them we're actually going to reduce the risk of that, the usage of that budget. And so by doing so, they agree to move forward. And very quickly, we give them examples of how it's creating a positive impact, how it's actually improving the outcomes for them. There are a number of examples out there. Most of these are proprietary and difficult for me to share. But what we're trying to do is create these simple efforts to move forward that we gain momentum on. Later steps in your strategy can tend to be larger because you've gotten rid of a lot of the risk. You've gotten a lot of the education into the organization. You have the understanding. There's a shared alignment. Early on, you really have to have those small iterative steps. Again, remember, think back to this approach. Don't cut the yarn in half. Untangle it a thread at a time. Okay, Ruslan, I do want to talk about one specific approach. And again, not directly advocating for Scaled Agile. However, let's be honest, I am a SAFe program consultant trainer. I've been working with Scaled Agile since 2012. I do firmly believe in the framework. I've seen it work time and time again. Where I've seen it not work, there are systemic issues that are not, they are patterns and practices that we go in and help to correct. However, working within or even before the framework or even external to the framework, this lean portfolio management course from Scaled Agile, I highly recommend. It is a fairly deep dive into what ails us today, how we can move that forward, and it starts to build a plan of how to move that forward and builds the skills within you of how you can move that forward. Now, from an Agile Sparks perspective, we strongly recommend the follow-up workshop. It's typically a 1 or 2 day workshop. This course can be taught publicly and you will learn a ton. In fact, we're going to talk about a public course offering that we have coming up, but you will learn a ton from this public course. The workshop is where you get to apply it. You get to really start to put things on the wall, create a strategy for your own organization. And it also frees you from the constraints of NDA issues and so forth from a public class. So our own recommended approach is to get the right level of training. We do recommend this lean portfolio management course, and then work with the internal workshop approach to really apply it in your organization. And that's where we can start to answer some of the private sector versus government sector, individual industries, domains, and again, start to help you find the measurements that you're looking for, start to find the right steps to take to move forward with.
Yes, and I think that it's very important to have that 1 day internal workshop, because it's really is a critical follow-up for the actual class, because it will give you the actual insight for your own organization, for your own context, and will allow you to unlock your own mechanism of how you're going to do that. In terms of our next classes, I think that Melissa can also introduce them before we go into the actual questions that we have. So Melissa, you want to talk about it for a second?
Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Cook. I am the training coordinator for Agile Sparks. And we wanted to share with you several of our upcoming courses that you see here. We have an SPC, Implementing SAFe, coming up starting tomorrow, and then again, September 7th. We've got the Release Train Engineer, September 8th, a SAFe Scrum Master, September 23rd. Lean Portfolio Management will be October 4th and 5th, and you will have the wonderful Dwayne Stroman instructing that. So you would get lucky there. And then we've got our Leading SAFe with SA certification September 30th. There are a number of more courses that we're offering. You can find them on our website. You can reach out to us to find out more details, and we'd love to help you with any questions you have.
Yes, and said that before we go into the questions, if you register in the next 48 hours, not only that you will get $200 off your class, your LPM class, you're also going to get this dandy, nice Agile Spark Scrum t-shirt that I'm modeling, and Melissa is modeling as well.
I did not get the memo, however.
Well, yes, Dwayne is modeling a different shirt, which you can get as well. Okay, so let's get into some of the questions, Dwayne.
Yeah. So I see one from Sridhar. Very good question. Does lab include budget gating process? Now, in every organization, the word budget gating or phase gates or that approach can be implemented differently. There are some standards. I shouldn't say standards. There are some common practices we see. What we see more is common impediments, where those things really slow down. And this is honestly where one of the areas where lean agile product development and traditional budgeting conflict the most is in the phase gate approach. Lean agile product development is based on the very fact that we learn as we go. We learn executable specifications. We learn what the specifications are. Most companies are starting to see the advantage of that and realizing that those detailed long lists of requirements can be very difficult to create, and in most cases are not that valuable. In fact, I remember from my development days how many times we would spend 2 months creating a technical design document, a design manual, and the first few lines of code we wrote disproved half of the assumptions. And so that is one of the areas that conflict the most, because the phase gate approach and the budget gating approach tends to really block that, because it says you have to have requirements done. You have to have this done. You have to have that done before you move forward. It does not take into account the fact that we're going to learn as we go. Now, is it one of the best places to implement lean agile budgeting? Yes. However, it tends to be the one that can be the most difficult. It's not always the first area we start with. Again, a lot of times it's in our sequencing that we start to provide the early initial benefits, such as standing up a Kanban to create a clear visibility and then having WSJF economic sequencing as part of it. However, once we get that Kanban in place, we start to create confidence in a different way of looking value outcome and value flow. And that's where we can have that conversation about that budget gating process. Can we start to loosen some of those constraints? And that's one of the keys to understand about moving from traditional to lean agile budgeting. It's a deprecation, not an addition. We are not adding things, we are subtracting things. And to be able to subtract those, we have to have the right organizational understanding, we have to have the right clarity, the right decentralized decision-making approaches in place, because we can't just throw things out the window and say, oh, we can budget however we want to, there's no damage. There could be a lot of damage caused. It's back to cutting the ball of yarn in half. So, but as we start to stand up things like a Kanban approach, we build confidence within the organization and they start to loosen the reins on the gating process. Does it disappear overnight? No. In fact, I don't recommend for it to disappear overnight, but we do start to create the confidence that we can remove it in this area, in this area, in this area, maybe decentralize the approval process on it and so forth.
And I think there's another question, Dwayne, from Sridhar. Can we do the budgeting based on each epic or story point?
Really good question. Now, this is where perhaps me and my colleagues tend to have a different approach than Scaled Agile. So let me share the two different approaches, and I'll highlight the approach I use because, frankly, that's what we tend to use the most. From a Scaled Agile perspective, we use a number of techniques, such as a concept called participatory budgeting that will help us inform our budgeting process. Should we be investing on this epic? Now, the difference that we take is we take this from a capacity approach. In other words, we've already funded the factory. Solving these set of problems in this value stream is worth X dollars or euros or pesos or whatever it might be to us. Go do as much value as you possibly can. Now, we're going to be collaborating with you along the way to make sure we're using that factory for the right outcomes and adjusting as we need to. but it's very much shoulder-to-shoulder collaboration. It's very collaborative approach. And so as we move forward, we're now looking at epics in a capacity approach. Now, again, my own approach is to take epics and use what we would call, if you're familiar with story points, I use epic points. Looking at these epics and saying, well, relative to this epic, how much volume, complexity, uncertainty, knowledge applies? Is that a fairly high level approach? Yes. A colleague of mine did some work a couple of years back, tabulated it from a couple of different organizations, and he came up with this number that when I saw the data he had, it absolutely made sense. After 15 minutes of assessment and estimation, we tend to lose value and in fact, we tend to lose accuracy on the actual estimate. And so that higher level estimate, again, keep in mind, we're learning as we go. And because we funded the factory, if this epic or this feature or even this story requires more value and it's still the most important thing to do, we keep going. There's no change management. There's no effort. The example I gave of the 2 Agile release trains that had the 2 project IDs to fund, they were able to keep going on features that perhaps weren't funded the same way, but because it was the most important thing, they kept going, and the outcome for all sponsors was actually very positive, improved from what they expected. So the bottom line is absolutely, you do need a way to relative size these epics against each other. Whether you choose to use story points for those, dollars can work, but it can lead to the wrong mindset, but it can be an intermediate step. I prefer to tend to use capacity points for those epics.
Thank you, Dwayne. We do have only 9 minutes left, and I see that we have quite a few questions.
Okay.
I do apologize in advance if we don't get to all of them. But if you have a question or you want to add anything, you can email us directly, or if you have a question regarding your organization, we can set up a call. And if not, and if we see a lot of questions here, we'll just have another webinar and Dwayne will answer all the questions.
So I do see one question from Dan on any techniques for satisfying the needs of accounting where there are often standards-based requirements for project budgeting accounting, even with groups who want to implement lean budgeting. That's a really good question. Again, this is that peeling the onion, that peeling the ball of yarn back piece by piece. For me, the first step is education. Let's get everyone on the same page that what we're doing today is not working the way we need it to. Either we find, or usually both, we find the inadequacies in the current budget process. And I'll be honest, in my work with the finance group area, I tend to find people that say, we know it doesn't work very well. When they're honest about it, they say, yeah, we know this is a struggle. We hate moving dollars from this column to that column and so forth. It's not what we were trying to do. It's not where we can really add value to the company, but based on our current system, it's what we have to do. Getting everybody on the same page on the value of moving forward is the first step. And it doesn't have to be everybody. So be careful with that word. Enough people that they say that there's momentum, that they say, yes, we need to move forward. Now, finding a relatively low risk area to change that also has a backup plan. So a lot of times we do a parallel path approach. We might say, let's see, we're going to, as part of this phase gate approach, we're going to continue with the approval process, but let's come into the approval process with what the decentralized decision approach would have created. And let's compare and contrast. And very often what happens is when they compare notes on that, they realize the decentralized approach actually had a much better outcome. And so they gain confidence in saying, well, maybe we can loosen the reins a bit more and a bit more. Again, that's where that ball of yarn approach comes in, is untangle that ball of yarn piece by piece. It not only will help everyone stay, take a breath and calm down and relax. This isn't a big change that we're going to upset the entire enterprise overnight, but instead it's an incremental iterative approach moving forward. And also it informs the next thread to pull on, the next area to work on.
Thanks, Dwayne. Another question from Lisa. Can you implement lab with 6-quarter rolling budgets?
Yes, you absolutely can. Here's the difference is your adjustments are going to be based on leading indicators, and they're probably going to be more often, at least your adjustment reviews. Now, Scaled Agile tends to recommend that you're going to have probably adjustments about twice a year. I'm not sure if it's that aligned to a specific cadence. I recommend a lightweight, high-level review process that is fed by leading indicators, innovation accounting that are coming in on steady state. We're continuing to get the data that tells us, is there a mid-flight adjustment we need to make? Those are not very often, but they do occur. However, on a quarterly basis, I prefer to look at that information and say, have we looked at this right? Does it make sense? Should we be making some adjustments? And the honest truth is, very often there are small incremental adjustments that end up having a very positive impact.
Thank you. And let's try to get to another question while we have time.
Okay.
Nick is asking, when we get to the point of funding value streams, what are typically gets funded within the value stream? Payroll, yes, but where do SaaS licenses, platform costs, consulting, etc. usually sit? Great
question. Now, that's a great question. And this is one of the areas where we can incrementally move forward. From a payroll perspective of funding people, that is the most important. For most of us, payroll is the biggest expense. So we are taking on the biggest effort first, but it's also the one that tends to have the most impact to moving forward from a Lean and Agile perspective. It's people we tend to move forward more. However, do we want to include the entire budget? Absolutely. Would we be making incremental adjustments to the, let's say, capitalization efforts? Would we be making changes to licensing and fees and so forth? Not as much, but within that value stream, we have the ability to do it if we need to. We don't have that approval process because we have an entire budget that is funding this factory. That includes the people. It also includes the machines. It even includes, as I said, the janitors. Everyone that's involved in helping to deliver on this value are part of that value stream. That's part of the funding model. Decentralize it to that decision and how we move forward. If that means we drop one license, one capability, one hardware platform perhaps, so that we can add some more people, we have that capability.
Got it. Thank you, Dwayne. And I think we're right about on money here. And as I mentioned before, if you have questions that you want to share with us later, please feel free to write us an email or call us. We'll be happy to answer. We mentioned we have our LPM class and other classes. Please feel free to register and take advantage of the discount and the free shirts. And I want to thank again Dwayne and Melissa for their time this afternoon. And again, thank you everyone for attendance, and have a great afternoon or evening wherever you're located.
And Ruslan, if I may, if anyone has questions, they want to have an ongoing conversation, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Just let me know that you attended the webinar and fire away. As you can tell, myself and John were very passionate about this, and we're kind of geeks about this. We love to help solve problems in this area. So
thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon or evening, and we will definitely share this stream with you after probably later today or tomorrow morning.